Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. It's late summer, and an unexplained influenza virus is killing international travelers. Researchers quickly identify the virus as a genetically engineered flu strain. Intelligence agencies find irrefutable evidence that the virus was created in a secret bioweapons laboratory in a middle-income country. It was accidentally released, but by the end, 50 million people are killed by this pathogen. This was the scenario presented to a group of experts at the Munich Security Conference in February who participated in what is known as a tabletop exercise. Their goal was to understand how key international players might respond to a situation like this and identify ways that such a scenario might be prevented from unfolding in the first place. My guest today, Jaime Yassif, helped design and implement this tabletop exercise. She is a senior fellow at NTI for Global Biological Policy and Programs, and in our conversation, we discuss what this fictional scenario reveals about very real gaps in international policies to prevent a catastrophic biological weapons event. I think you'll appreciate this episode. You know, one of the goals I have with this podcast is to shine a spotlight on undercovered global stories and also undercovered global policy ideas. And certainly some of the policy ideas presented throughout this conversation are ones that deserve urgent attention, and all the more so in light of the current COVID pandemic that we are all experiencing. You know, the scenario that was created for this tabletop exercise was created before the pandemic. And as Jaime Yassif explains, some of the lessons from the scenario can certainly be applied to our world today. Also, I'm realizing now that I'm publishing this episode nearly exactly 1 year after I published my episode asking the question of whether or not we are prepared for the next big global epidemic, which unfortunately was somewhat prophetic in retrospect. But hopefully this episode certainly won't be. Anyway, I think you'll enjoy it. Here is my conversation with Dr. Jaime Yassif of NTI.
In February of this year, we hosted a tabletop exercise on high consequence biological threats, which took place during the Munich Security Conference. And the Munich Security Conference is a really important global meeting that happens every year. It convenes national leaders from around the world to focus on important international security issues of the day and talk about challenges and talk about solutions. And so we were really delighted to have the opportunity to bring our work that's focused on reducing biological threats to this venue, because we really wanted to engage that community on these really important issues.
And I saw that at least two of the participants in your tabletop exercise were previous guests on this podcast. Senator Sam Nunn has been on the show, and Richard Hatchett, the CEO of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative. So you had a number of pretty high profile and people and other experts participate in this, correct?
Absolutely. We feel really grateful to have such amazing thought leaders and leaders in the international community on the issue of biosecurity and pandemic preparedness. You know, the exercise generally involved an international group of senior leaders with many years of experience and deep expertise across public health, international security, scientific research, and biosecurity. So we're just deeply grateful for their time and their engagement and their help with our work to work to reduce global biological risks.
So walk me through the scenario. And I think it's worth emphasizing, as you do in the report, that this scenario was conceived before the COVID-19 pandemic, although the tabletop exercise played out, as you said, in February 2019, just as sort of the seriousness of this disease was sort of being felt and being understood around the world. But can you just sort of walk us through what is the scenario that you presented to your participants?
Yes, our event had been planned prior to the emergence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus late last year. But in our, we saw striking similarities in how the fictional disease scenario that we developed swept the globe and foreshadowed the widespread impact and paralyzing knock-on effects that the world is now experiencing as a result of the COVID pandemic. So that was kind of a surprise for us. But I'm happy to walk through this scenario. So
yeah. Explain what happened. How did 50 million people end up dying?
Yeah, it's so the events in our scenario begin in the late in the summer of 2020 as an unexplained and deadly influenza virus kills a number of international travelers from the fictional country of Apulia. So we made up fake country names for this exercise for extra fun. And so our research, as part of the scenario, research teams rapidly sequence the responsible virus strain and they identify it as an engineered version of influenza. And these are really credible teams. They're affiliated with WHO International Lab Network.
And it's just worth pausing there in terms of creating a parallel to COVID. The COVID sequence was also very rapidly sequenced shortly after its discovery.
That's correct. And it's really, this is just generally important. You want, when you initially detect a new pathogen that has global consequences, potentially, you really want to understand it as quickly as possible, understand what it is, understand how risky it might be, where it might have come from, and what kind of risks it poses to national and global populations. So that makes, that makes a lot of sense. That's what you would expect in that kind of situation.
But unlike COVID, the sequencing that unfolded in your scenario revealed that it was some sort of genetically engineered flu-like strain.
Exactly. So that's right. That was the conclusion that the laboratories came to in this fictional scenario. And that started to raise some eyebrows. And then basically, as the scenario unfolds, characters in the scenario start to grapple with, what does this mean? Why did this happen? Who could have done such a thing? What would be their motivations? And so as the scenario progresses, researchers using a variety of scientific means identify a state-run laboratory in Apulia as the likely source of the initial outbreak. The government of Apulia, the fictional country, claims that this laboratory is part of a purely defensive biopreparedness program. So they're saying, yes, you trace this back to our laboratory, but this laboratory is conducting legitimate work. There's nothing to see here. But the exercise scenario concludes with additional intelligence sources that provide irrefutable evidence that the state-run lab in Apulia is in fact a secret bioweapons facility, and that the spread of the deadly virus resulted from a lab accident with catastrophic consequences. And by the end of the exercise, the global case count is more than 2 billion, with a B, billion. That's a huge fraction of the global human population on Earth. And then more than 50 million lives have been lost as a result of the virus's spread. So that's the scenario.
And Apulia is what kind of country? Do you assign a region to it?
So we're very deliberately being agnostic about where it is in the world because we don't want this to be political. We want to focus on the issues. But it's a middle-income country with a rapidly growing biotechnology industry. And it is struggling with its transition to democracy. So those are the characteristics of Apulia.
And so it is discovered with irrefutable evidence that this virus that's rapidly spreading across the globe is a genetically modified flu strain, deadly flu strain that came from this bioweapons facility. So what's like the international response?
I think the international community is really struggling. They have a variety of conflicting views about what to do. So some of Apulia's allies defend them and say the so-called irrefutable evidence is questionable. We don't really believe the story. We should hear Apulia out. we should have a higher standard before we make such claims. And others are outraged and they see the rising death toll and increasing case counts in their countries and globally, and they want to see accountability for a PLEA. So it really divides the international community. And this is what we believe we could reasonably expect in this kind of scenario, that there wouldn't necessarily be international consensus on even just the underlying truth of what has happened, and as a result, what we should do about it. And that's a real challenge.
So, I mean, in the end, is this situation just sort of resolved when and if they develop a vaccine to this virus?
So we don't tie up the exercise in a tidy bow. So there's no vaccine at the end of the rainbow, even though one would hope that would eventually happen. It's mostly the purpose of the exercise is to draw the attention of our participants and the broader international community to some of the challenges that these kind of scenarios would raise for us, and highlight the importance of taking urgent action now to strengthen global capabilities to prevent and effectively respond to these kinds of events so that we are prepared for them and we manage these challenges.
So to that end, what did this exercise reveal about the deficiencies of the Biological Weapons Convention, which I think is like 40-something years old at this point?
Sure. Happy to talk about that. I might sort of step back for a second and sort of share the broad takeaways from the exercise, and then I'm happy to drill down on the implications specifically for the BWC, if that's okay with you. Go
for it.
So, there are basically three key takeaways from the exercise. And that's a reflection of the agreement that was reached among participants about three major shortfalls within the international system. So one of them is just that, the recognition that bioscience and biotechnology is advancing rapidly, it's spreading globally, and it's accessible to more and more people, which is fantastic and has tremendous potential. But those developments have not been matched with the development of norms and governance mechanisms and best practices to manage potential associated risks of deliberate misuse or accidental release. So that's the first finding. We just don't have sufficient institutional capability and process to deal with that. The second finding is that, and this has some connections to the Biological Weapons Convention. I'm happy to get into that in greater detail. The international community lacks robust transparency measures to clarify the intentions and capabilities of bioscience research and development that is being conducted in countries around the world. And that's dangerous because it can lead to potentially dangerous misperceptions and suspicions about what countries are up to with bioscience within their borders, and whether or not they're in compliance with the Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits development and use of biological weapons.
I see. So presumably, I don't know a lot about the Biological Weapons Convention, but presumably if it's like other weapons conventions that you have, participating signatory countries have this sort of, voluntary review in which they disclose, say, the locations and the uses of their facilities that might potentially be dual use facilities. I presume there's something like that in the Biological Weapons Convention where there's some sort of reporting mechanism.
So that's basically true. So the Biological Weapons Convention, unlike the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention, does not have a verification provision, which in other treaties is binding. So states parties to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention are, once they make such commitments, are legally bound to disclose information. And there's a whole apparatus. So there's an apparatus. I mean, there's also voluntary elements, but there are binding elements, and there's an apparatus to support that. The BWC is unusual or different from those other two in the sense that it has a very small staff that supports it, a very small annual budget, and there are no binding there's no binding verification protocol. What it does have instead is a variety of measures. So there are the confidence building measures, which were established roughly 30 years ago. And that basically requires states parties are strongly encouraged to report, to sort of engage in the kind of transparency that you were just talking about a moment ago, share information about the bioscience and research and development that's going on within their borders, share any information about dual use research, and so forth. There also are some, unfortunately, these CBMs, in the last 3 years, I think less than half of states' parties have actually submitted those. So there's a challenge there. And another
What's a CBM? Is a CBM what they call like the disclosure mechanism?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's the confidence building measures. Sometimes we refer to them
okay.
as CBMs for short. Thanks for the clarification. So less than half of the states' parties are currently submitting these on an annual basis, and they haven't been updated for almost 30 years. So there's potential for improvement there. There's also something called voluntary peer review, and that's an initiative that a number of states parties to the BWC have taken upon themselves to organize, and they want to build on and reinforce transparency measures. So they conduct voluntary site visits to each other's facilities in an effort to bolster international transparency as it relates to the convention.
But in reading your report, like your key recommendations aren't just to bolster the Biological Weapons Convention. They're to sort of create like new global governance mechanisms for this kind of new reality.
Absolutely. So I already spoke to two of the shortfalls. There's a sort of shortfall for governing rapid advances in science and technology. There's a shortfall in transparency measures. So notwithstanding all the things I just spoke about, we feel like there's a lot of room for improvement, and there is an urgent need to bolster transparency. And then third, we believe that there also has to be stronger international capacity to rapidly investigate the source of biological events when we don't know their origin. And we have to be able to do that during a crisis. And we believe that we need to do a lot of institution building and capacity building, because those are three major gaps. I'm happy to get more into details about any and all of them if you'd like. Just let me know where you'd like to dig in.
I mean, it's on this last recommendation that you just spoke that I got a little hung up on your report. So, as you say, you recommend the creation of some sort of entity, perhaps affiliated with the UN, that is able to rapidly investigate an incident of suspicious derivation having to do with some sort of biological weapons incident. And again, sort of coming back to like the current the current COVID example, initially early on you had these, the World Health Organization was just kind of relying on China to provide it with information, which is sort of how the WHO is set up. But you're not sort of seeking to work through the WHO, you're seeking to sort of create a new mechanism. Can you just sort of talk me through what in an ideal type this mechanism might look like and how it might function?
Absolutely. And before I get into that, I just want to sort of explain the rationale and why we see a gap. So this, this mechanism or this function is operating at the seams between the mission and scope of what WHO does very well and what the United Nations Secretary General's office does. So the WHO is great at conducting public health investigations to figure out what's going on when we see a naturally emerging pandemic, right? They're excellent at that. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the UN Secretary General's mechanism. And that mechanism was established to give the Secretary General the authority to deploy an investigation, an evidence-based investigation involving a multilateral team, a multinational team, to in response to specifically to allegations that a state has used a biological weapon. But there is those mechanisms exist, but there is nothing at the present moment that works in between those two ends of the spectrum. So if we're not sure if it was naturally emerging or deliberately caused or an accidental release, there's no strong tool to do that. And so that's really the gap that we have identified. And to answer your question, please.
Well, I mean, just to stop you there, if you're a PLIA, why would you consent to an international investigation on your territory? And you would probably have to wait until the Security Council authorizes sort of like the violation of your sovereignty for the investigation to happen. I'm thinking again of a comparison to the joint investigative mechanism that was created in response to chemical weapons attacks in Syria, where you had, where you had, the Security Council initially created this. Russia put up some opposition to it, but they eventually let it happen, though with some constrictions. Then when it became clear that the joint investigative mechanism was going to identify that pro-regime elements and the regime itself was responsible for the use of chemical weapons, Russia just put a kibosh on the report and killed the joint investigative mechanism. And so it's that, when I said I sort of got hung up on this recommendation, it's at that point that in this sort of fictional scenario where I see sort of an investigative mechanism kind of falling apart absent unity at the Security Council. But that unity, at least in today's geopolitics, doesn't seem to exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a number of interesting points. So first of all, I would note that I wouldn't necessarily assume that the Security Council that you would need consensus within the Security Council. That we did highlight within our exercise that the Security Council politics would make a coherent international response to this kind of event extraordinarily challenging, which is why we're thinking really hard about creative solutions that are internationally viable. The fact that the country in question, in this case, Aplia, would have a strong incentive to resist an investigation, in our view, highlights one of the shortfalls of taking a purely WHO-based approach. I don't think WHO wants to be in a position where they're battling to gain access. That's not really their business, and they don't really want to be in that position. One of the benefits of the UN Secretary General's mechanism is that the Secretary General has the authority to launch an investigation and does not need to go through the Security Council. That's why that authority is so powerful and why that mechanism is so important. We did engage in some, and in fact, during the scenario, I believe that part of the scenario involved the fact that Aplia did turn WHO investigators away or wasn't particularly compliant and was difficult to deal with. I think some creative thinking will be necessary to sort of compel the country in question to comply. They may have some interest in doing so. If you think about it, if you're the national leader of a given country and you're being accused by the international community of engaging in wrongdoing, or you're suspicious, you're going to want to demonstrate that you're a good actor and you have nothing to hide. So that will create some counter pressure to those kinds of incentives. And there are other tools, but that is challenging. I think, for the joint assessment mechanism, what we're trying to think through at this point, at this point, we've identified a gap in the system, and we know that it's really important to fill that gap. And I think COVID has really highlighted why that's important. I think there are two things that really need to be thought through, and we're actively working on this in consultation with colleagues internationally. One is just, how do you launch this mechanism? Who has the authority to do so? I think, should it be tied to the WHO? Should it be tied to the UN Secretary General? Should it be a combination of those entities? It should be a different entity. That's an open question. You want to set the bar high enough so that you don't have frivolous investigations, but you don't want to set it so high that the mechanism can't be used. And so I think that's really where the devil is in the details. And I think that question is also very salient to the challenge that you rightly point out. But I do agree that if it required going to the Security Council, that would be unlikely to succeed. The other,
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say on the response mechanism is one thing, but it's sort of preventing countries from acquiring the technology, or perhaps even the incentive to want to acquire the technology to create a genetically modified flu strain is another question. How do you sort of prevent an Aplia from wanting to create a bioweapons program in the first place?
So, really what it comes down to is influencing a country's capabilities and intentions. That's the simplest answer. And I think, the more resources a country has at its disposal, the less likely you are to succeed at influencing its capabilities. It's very hard to constrain capabilities, but you can influence intentions. And I think that there are basically two pieces of that. One is you want to avoid unnecessary risk perception. So you want to, that's why transparency is so important. You don't want countries around the world believing that their incorrectly believing or being unsure about whether or not their neighbors are violating the terms of the Biological Weapons Convention, and therefore feeling that they need to, engage in some exploratory research of their own to see if they might need to defend themselves, right? We just don't want an environment of mutual misperception and suspicion, which can lead to arms racing. That's a really undesirable world. And that's why transparency is critically important to build trust, enhance confidence, increase clarity about the capabilities and intentions of other countries. The second aspect of prevention is basically deterrence. So, you want to influence the cost benefit calculation of the country in question, make them think, well, if my country were to develop such a weapon and or possibly use it, what are the odds that we are going to face negative consequences that are unacceptable to us? And to the extent that there are strong international capabilities to correctly attribute the source of a bio event, either an accidental release or a deliberate attack, and to hold that country accountable in a way that is, using an internationally viable mechanism. The stronger those systems are, we believe the greater deterrent capability that has, because a country will say, well, we're not necessarily going to get away with this. We might get caught. We might be held accountable. Perhaps this is not a desirable path, and we should choose other means of bolstering our national defense.
Do you have a sense of how many countries out there fit APLIA's profile in terms of having the capacity and sort of the weak, the sort of weak or quasi-authoritarian governance structures? Or let me put it this way: how many countries out there fit APLIA's profile and might be a potential source for the scenario that you describe unfolding?
Yeah, so, that's a really interesting question. I think a lot of people would like the answer to it. That's not something that, I have personally studied closely, so it's a bit outside my area of expertise. But what I can tell you is that, because of the rapid advances in bioscience and the fact that this technology is spreading globally and the barriers to entry are falling over time, the capability is within reach of more and more countries. And really the question is, which countries feel that they need these kinds of capabilities to defend themselves? Which countries feel like for any variety of geopolitical reasons or risk perceptions or their, the perception of what their neighbors are doing or their adversaries are doing, feel that they need to defend themselves and would, through a variety of processes, come to the conclusion that this is a good tool. So we really want to address that, the risk perception, while also, trying to constrain capabilities as well.
So finally, I'm glad you mentioned that sort of the accessibility of this technology is increasing and seems to only increase over time. So does that suggest that this is something that even if you don't have sort of the capacity of a state, that you could create, like a doomsday group or a terrorist organization create a genetically modified H2N2 virus that, kills 50 million people?
Well, so that's a really important question. I'm really glad you asked that. That's a question we think about a lot at NTI, and we're in fact quite concerned about it. So we were worried both about state actors and non-state actors and their potential ability to create a really sophisticated biological weapon that could cause devastating harm to large numbers of people and could result in a biological event that's global in scope and catastrophic in impact. And that's why we're so focused on our work around norms and governance for rapidly advancing bioscience, especially in areas where there's dual use research. And the reason we care about this so deeply is we're precisely trying to prevent that kind of outcome. While I personally believe that the best way to sort of prevent undesirable outcomes with states is to shape their intentions. I think there is a chance to constrain the capabilities of non-state actors. They do not have the kinds of resources necessarily that states do. And that's why, norms and best practices for for bioscience research is critical. And the way that can work is sort of twofold. One is preventing something that we call so let me just back up a second. The reason that work is important is we want to prevent the exploitation of the legitimate global bioscience research and development enterprise from being exploited by malicious actors, such as, types of terrorists you talked about. And the way that you can do that is sort of twofold. One is you want to prevent information hazards. And what that term means is, well-intentioned scientists going about and, doing cool research that they think is really going to improve our capabilities in some fashion, but maybe hasn't thought that through and has published a paper that makes it easier for other people, perhaps with less knowledge, to develop, to engineer or synthesize a pathogen. So we're trying to find effective means to prevent that from happening. And in fact, recently there was a group. So Nature, the journal Nature recently published a paper where researchers showed how to synthesize from scratch the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and also shared information more generally about how you can synthesize a broad range of viruses from DNA that you can buy or RNA you can buy over the internet. And so, we are concerned about those kinds of publications, and we see that as an information hazard. The second piece is not just about information, it's also about access to materials and services. So, there are companies that provide DNA synthesis services. There are repositories that share pathogen samples with researchers. There are increasingly these places called cloud labs that will help you design and engineer microbes for science research. And we really want to make sure that we're cooperating with those companies and those providers to make sure that they're not inadvertently selling the building blocks of dangerous pathogens to malicious actors. And so that work
this is a totally unregulated space.
No, it's not totally unregulated. It's not as well governed as we would ideally like. There is a bright spot in DNA synthesis. About 80% of global market share of DNA synthesis orders is screened. Many companies have voluntarily joined an international consortium that's doing that, and it's voluntary. I mean, I think so there are two shortcomings. One is that it's not 100% of global market share, so there's a big 20% gap there. And the other thing that's worth noting is that it's not required in any country around the world. All these companies are doing it on a voluntary basis. And we at NTI believe that perhaps that should change. And so all these questions that I'm raising, all of this, these are really challenging questions about what is it, about norms and best practices for biosecurity. How do you ensure that the global bioscience research and development enterprise can thrive and bring about all the tremendous benefits that it can offer, but also guard against the risks? And that's why we believe that it would be beneficial to develop an international entity that's dedicated to this work to reduce emerging biological risks associated with rapid advances in technology. This could be done possibly in consultation with a UN agency. This could be done by a non-governmental organization. We believe that an effort like this should involve experts from across multiple sectors, including the scientific community, the international security, public health, and philanthropic communities. So we think that's really important. Going back to your original point about preventing terrorists from getting access to potentially dangerous technologies that could cause tremendous harm.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, your report obviously identifies a number of big gaps in global governance in this key area. And thank you so much for explaining it all.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for your interest in this important work.
And thank you in advance for preventing a global catastrophe from befalling the world if enough people read your report.
We're doing our best. We hope that others will join us in this effort.
All right. Thanks. All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Jaime Yassif. That was great. Very helpful. And, exercises like these are intended to shake policymakers from their complacence. So, if you're a policymaker listening to this, I urge you to read the report. Anyway, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.